Mine, your thoughts, your prayers, and what with April in the background, sort of. She does have some slides, and as I said, I don't really know what to say about them. So, like when they come, if you have anything you would like to say about them, by all means do that. But we're going to talk about eschatology a little bit. I like the term spin, so I went with it. It sometimes has negative connotations, but I like spin. You know, spins are fun, and so we're going to do a Wesleyan spin on eschatology this afternoon, starting right here. So I want to start with a reminder about Randy Maddox last fall, and you might recall he had a handout. I kept my handout. Many of you did too, because you're dutiful people. And beautiful, but dutiful in this case. The third point in his handout, it was on like, what does it mean to be a Wesleyan? So his third of 3 points was to be a Wesleyan is, and you don't have to be a Wesleyan, I'm thinking already about Rebecca, but you know, is to appreciate the whole list. I know not just Rebecca, but she's the one I know best as a non-Wesleyan. To appreciate the holistic nature of salvation. Salvation not just for individuals, but for society. Not just for souls, but for bodies as well. And I think one thing we can say for sure, as Wesley aged, where we might think, you know, I could imagine a person getting older and thinking, well, bodies don't matter so much because I'm tired of being in mine. And, you know, having my soul saved would be plenty. But the fact is, as Wesley got older, a more full-bodied understanding of salvation actually became increasingly important to him. And then I highlighted the third one because that's actually what we're talking about today, where in many ways, while Wesley might not have been absolutely unique in his time, it was somewhat unusual that you would begin to think beyond humans to the whole creation. Again, now, not out of nowhere. He certainly had influences, but that's the point we really want to talk about today. What does it mean to talk about redemption or salvation for the more than human world? And really what I'm going to ask us to try to think about is creation in its biggest sense, which is, of course, more than our planet and more than our solar system, and even more than our doggone huge galaxy. So we're going to kind of go there eventually. Here's a quotation from his marvelous book. This is, I highly recommend this book to you. Mine's beaten and worn now, but Randy Maddox, Responsible Grace. Somebody needed to get a little more creative with the cover. There's no question. This is very boring. John Wesley's Practical Theology. This is from near the end of the book. In fact, his chapter on eschatology, where we usually do put it at the end. And Maddox wrote, in the medieval West, and I know that in this paragraph he'd mentioned St. Augustine, that would be a main figure, the role of a future resurrection became increasingly moot. When heaven is epitomized in static and ethereal terms, essentially the idea of when I die, my soul hopefully goes up to heaven, okay? The biblical notion, you know, and it is a biblical notion, I don't know if it's a universally biblical notion, but it's certainly in the Bible, of the new heavens and the new earth fades from view, because all you're thinking about is that transcendent spiritual realm above. The tendency was for the Bible's temporal hope of God's future vindication of the righteous and restoration of creation. The tendency was for that to be exchanged for a Neoplatonic, and I think you all get the idea there, model of the timeless transcendental relationship of heaven, earthly life, and hell. A model given classic description by Dante in the early 14th century. That's, again, a quotation from Maddox. Then a little bit later in that same chapter, it's clear that Wesley changed his thinking, changed his preaching on this over time, but especially near the end of his life. There was a growing insistence on the redemption of all creation that runs through Wesley's late writings. And he doesn't specifically mention these, I mean, he does refer to all these sermons, but here are the three that, in my opinion, really epitomize what it is that Maddox was talking about. Of the three, the most famous by far now is the general deliverance. You notice the dates for these: 1781, 83, 85. He died in 1791. He was 78 years old when he first published that sermon, so he was 80 for this one and 82 for this one. So, I hope that when I get to 80, that'd be great to be even every other year. And he, of course, he did a lot of stuff in between as well. But these three really are like the big trio. I have quotations, representative quotations from each coming up. But I'll just say of this one, this is the one that gets a lot of attention today in eco-theology. If people are appealing to Wesley like at all, it's this sermon. In this sermon, he sort of grandly speculates, there's no doubt that he does some grand speculation, about all creatures who have ever lived being a part of the age to come. Every creature. Not even like in a representative for every species, And, he also knows that people might think, why in the world am I speculating about this? And I'll just tell you, his bottom line is, if we think of these creatures as beloved by God, whose suffering matters to God, now in this world, might that not move us to a more compassionate relationship in dealing with the more than human world? So that's a little bit of the general deliverance. I'm highlighting this one because this is the one I'm going to focus on in a little bit. One that in many ways probably gets overlooked, but it's become like the one that really fascinates me. So I'm excited to share it with you. And then the third, the new creation, which of course is where actually the title for this presentation comes from. And all three of these are really about like the world to come. So not so much about like heaven above, but about the world to come, or a new creation. And really the question for Wesley is going to be, how does that come about? Because like our automatic answer would be, well, God will have to bring that about. But the moment you say that, you're going to kind of run into a little bit of a tension in Wesley's theology, given how much emphasis he places on human cooperation or partnership with God's activity. But we'll see that as we go. In fact, I think that tension actually occurs not so much within these sermons, but between them. I'd like to go, I might have compromised the readability of this a little bit, but I really like that pattern, so deal with it. But I'll read it. This is also from Randy Maddox. In fact, I guess one more time from Brother Maddox. I think he'll like that. I hope he sees this someday. In essence, Wesley's focus of redemptive expectation increasingly shifted from a transcendent heaven to a future new creation. So less like this and more like that, okay? His late sermons, and I'm telling you the three that really are the biggies. Well, in fact, there may be more than one sermon in this case. He does say sermons. But I'll tell you, the rest of this paragraph, his late sermons connecting the Methodist revival with the increase of the reign of God in the world, simply extended this expectation to corporate human life, while he'd already extended it to all of creaturely existence. But in fact, in the sermon, the general spread of the gospel, I think that's the sermon that Randy's talking about. But again, we're going to look at that one in some detail. Oh my goodness. So this is my one quotation. It's a lot of words. But this is from the General Deliverance. This passage, or this sermon is based on Romans 8. Of course, all of creation groans. You know the passage. And of course, this is King James, so it's kind of, quaint and fun. The whole creation groaneth together. But I love what he puts in next, whether human beings are listening or not. Oh. So their groans are not dispersed into idle air, but enter into the ears of God who made them. While God's creatures travail together in pain, another lifting from Romans 8, he knoweth all their pain and is bringing them nearer and nearer to the birth, which shall be accomplished in its season. God seeth the earnest expectation. Again, you see, he just peppers this with little phrases from Romans 8, wherewith the whole animated creation waiteth for that final manifestation of the children of God, in which they themselves, all these creatures, also shall be delivered. And then I love in parentheses, not by annihilation. God's not going to destroy all those creatures. That's not deliverance. That's annihilation. So delivered from the present bondage of corruption into a measure, and even there you notice, like in Romans, it's into the glorious liberty of the children of God. And Wesley's, he makes it a little humble, well, into some measure, they'll share to some degree. And one of the things I like about Wesley is that he would say it that way, like every creature has various capacities. And not all creatures perhaps can receive from God in the same way or to the same extent. And again, I'm talking beyond humans, although he'd say the same thing about humans. And God respects that degree or that capacity and works always with the creature, in their real existence. I love this excerpt. This is from the New Creation. So again, I'm just giving you representative quotations now, but this is a great one from a sermon that I really don't like much. It's too speculative. And the world that I'll just tell you, of the three, this is the one I wouldn't be so enthusiastic to recommend, although I love this. He goes into a lot of detail of what he thinks the new creation will be like, and it has no mountains, no valleys, nothing, it's all smooth. There's nothing like interesting about it. But it's his notion of what a beautiful creation would be, I guess. But, so how many millions of creatures in the sea, in the air, and on every part of the earth can now no otherwise preserve their own lives than by taking away the lives of others, by tearing in pieces and devouring their poor, innocent, unresisting fellow creatures, exclamation point. So I'm going to pause here for a minute. One of our colleagues here, Dr. Andy Nosal, is working sort of in this area, especially with the creatures that do really, really, really what seem like really nasty things to other creatures. Let's forget about what human beings do for a minute, because it's all those creatures out there. But Wesley definitely attributed all of that to sin. So he's got a pretty, we'll say, traditional notion that had developed by his time that any suffering, sorrow, and even in the animal world was attributable, was caused by Adam's fall. Okay. Now, that's one of the things we're going to have to ask, okay, we live in a different world, scientifically speaking. How well will that wash? But doing a little bit more here, at least he had compassion for them. Miserable lot of such innumerable multitudes who, insignificant as they seem, like to us, and look at this language he uses, are the offspring of one common father. That's pretty interesting language. Because he's talking about snails and pelicans and, and everything in between and beyond. The creatures of the same God of love. It is probable that not only 2/3 of the animal creation, but 99 out of 100, and I think it's probably more like 100 out of 100, are under a necessity of destroying others in order to preserve their own life, even if it's just of destroying, we'll say, plant life. But it shall not always be so. God that sitteth upon the throne will soon change the face of all things and give a demonstrative proof to all of his creatures that his mercy is over all his works. So he did expect this soon, I think it's safe to say, and that God would change the scenery of creation. One of the reasons I love this quotation, by the way, I'd gone through and I'd put a bunch of God in there, and I guess I didn't save the right disc. Anyway, this is the way what he actually wrote. Psalm 145:9, God's mercy is over all that God has made, is one. In fact, Randy even alluded to this one last year. This is one of Wesley's favorite biblical texts, and he's applying it specifically to the more than human world. In fact, Psalm 149 says, I think the Lord is good or kind to all, and his mercy is over all his work. So he took the first half to mean all humans, and the second half to mean all the other creatures, which was nifty, probably not a good translation or interpretation, but it was Wesley's, and he loves Psalm 145:9 for that reason. But now moving quickly, we could ask, how do we imagine new creation nowadays? This is one of April's slides, you might guess. Not that I couldn't take this off the internet or something. In fact, I don't know if you can see my measure of technology is that I had to take a photograph of it So like with my camera on the screen because I didn't know how to, should I be admitting to that? Anyhow, this is Carina Nebula. So what we're doing is we're starting out like way out there. You don't need me to tell you. Are we talking billions probably of galaxies? At least millions. At least millions. Is that right, Rebecca? At least millions. I know. But we're talking at least millions of galaxies.
Carl Sagan says billions.
Yeah, probably. I mean, who knows? Perhaps countless. Oh my goodness. Well, of course, millions is countless, but infinite is probably the word I wanted. Okay, so how do we imagine new creation? Here's the point. Increasingly in the last few decades, and N.T. Wright is a big writer figure in this, not the only one. In fact, in Christian theology generally, I'd say in the last 80 to 100 years, the strong emphasis has been away from the transcendental notion of salvation that sort of banks on that I have a soul that's going to go someplace when I die, so I want to make sure it goes the right direction, much more toward a resurrection hope that's somehow about bodily existence. And once you begin to talk about bodily existence, it's hard not to begin to talk about like bodies in relationship to other bodies in existence, human and otherwise. And you just automatically are going to move toward a more holistic idea about what redemption would entail. Well, if we rightfully insist that our faith is that the God we worship is the creator of all things, visible and invisible, as it says in the Nicene Creed, that would include all galaxies everywhere, and even if there's a multiverse or whatever. And then we begin to ask, okay, well, when we talk about new creation, are we just talking about planet Earth? Like this little teeny tiny, backwaters. I mean, it's great that we're here and all. But, like in the vastness of the universe, it would begin to stretch our minds as to what it would entail to talk about a new creation in that way. Okay? So, and of course, John Wesley, who lived in the 18th century, did not have any notion about this. I was amazed. Well, I won't waste time. 4:15, huh? Let's go. All right, so I'm basically the same question. Should Christian eschatology be, I thought about the term geocentric, so I went with geoprovincial. Like, is for us eschatology about our planet, and our planet alone? That seems to me to put awfully binding, chains on God, the creator. I guess she sent me this one because here's our solar system. I do see that. So this must be our galaxy, I'm guessing. What do we call it again? The Milky Way. Does that look like the Milky Way to you all? I don't want to mislead you. But here we are down here. And, Wesley in his time, he's got this wonderful essay called The Case of Reason Partially. I love it. Impartially considered, not partially, impartially, because he wants to be reasonable about it. And he's actually very high, you need to know, very high in his estimation of human reason. Very high. He says, let reason do all it can. I think that needs to be heard. But he says, in his time, he couldn't imagine that we would ever know how far away the moon is. That's never going to be knowledge that we'll have. Okay? Never. Forget about the sun. Who knows? Isn't that interesting? So now he wouldn't decry that we've now, figured that out, but it's not his world. Gee whiz. And even just our own solar system, the sun, that big, 93 million miles from Earth, and that's the rest of our solar system. I don't know what April would say about that. I don't know if anybody has anything they would like to say about it. I mean, I just think even our solar system seems terribly big, and yet it's like, come on, grain of sand. How do we think about eschatology or a new creation in the kind of understanding of the universe that we have now? That's part of the question. Then we get closer to April's stuff, and I would say also to Rebecca's stuff. But I'm just putting up the slides. But I did put in the commentary, the Earth not to mention the universe, is far stranger and unimaginably more complex than Wesley, and I could say, or that even we can imagine, or that Wesley could have imagined, certainly in the 18th century. But I do think we have an increasingly deep sense of wonder. We certainly should. And I'm assuming very old universe, evolution, of which Wesley could have no idea. He did see what he thought of as a gradation of being in the world, but he thought of it as a chain of being, not unlike the sort of, heaven up here, and then, sort of get down to creation and human beings are at the top. And he actually knew that the apes would be the great apes are the next thing down, because he kind of saw the similarity. He thought that must have been sort of like a rough draft type thing before God got, so he sees this chain of being, but it's definitely vertical rather than any sort of historical, long biological process over, and then we're back to those unimaginable number of years. She's got all these words up here, I understand some common ancestry. I don't know about phylogenetics, but, what is phylogenetics? Rebecca, give us a quick one.
It's basically the tree of life. So how are related, we're closer to the apes, and within the apes, we're closer to the chimpanzees and the bonobos and stuff like that.
Thank you very much. That's very good. See, very good. And then we got extinction here too. That's a sobering one. All right, so the basic point here would be, many are the theologians who rightly are asking, how do we think about eschatological teachings as our understanding of the universe changes and gets bigger and more complicated, complex, and old? And even the old part's kind of important, I think. So, Brother Wesley, do we try to imagine a cosmic universal redemption, like of the whole ding-dang-dong universe, multiverse, whatever, in our eschatology? Or shall we instead attempt a humbler, more local approach to eschatology? And I want to kind of unpack that as we go. I would say that in the general deliverance, it's the big picture. But again, for him, the picture isn't as big as it is for us. It gets more complicated. He didn't even know about dinosaurs. Like, if you're going to talk about every creature that ever existed being raised to some kind of life, and he even thought maybe a bump up in that chain of being, so that like animals like horses, and he liked horses, that would be bumped up to the next degree where they would be like humans in knowing, loving, and enjoying God in the world to come. But you got Tyrannosaurus Rex and all those raptors. And again, not that he thought of a representative for every, or anything like that, but like he imagined this world with all these creatures, mostly because they'd all suffered under Adam's transgression so badly and did not deserve a bit of it. So God will not let that go, will not let their pain be unaddressed. Which again, even if like his science is a little weird, the theology is kind of cool. I guess people will say that about our science someday. Will they? Not about Rebecca's, but. So now I'm going to go quickly here, Thinking with John Wesley's, this has become the most important sermon to me of John Wesley's. In the issue of eschatology, the general spread of the gospel, you can Google it and get the whole manuscript and all. I'm going to give you an awful lot of it in the next few minutes. This is a picture of John Wesley preaching upon his father's tomb, or at least upon his grave. He did not preach this sermon there, but it's a nice picture. He starts this sermon, by the way, he's a very old man, in his 80s at the time, and he basically catalogs all the things wrong with the world in 1785 or 6. And the catalog's really long. He takes a long time. And there are a lot of evils. I picked out one that he was particularly vocal in his opposition about, the African slave trade. So we don't have time to read everything. You can read it on your own, but let me lift this up. So he gives this grim picture and says, such is the present state of mankind in all parts of the world. How astonishing is this? Like, if there's a God in heaven, and if his eyes are over all the earth, Can God despise the work of God's own hand? Surely this is one of the greatest mysteries under heaven. How is it possible to reconcile this either with the wisdom or goodness of God? You know, what traditionally called the problem of evil, or theodicy, if you know the fancy word. And what can give ease to a thoughtful mind under so melancholy a prospect as the kind of world in which we live? What but the consideration that things will not always be so, that another scene will soon be opened. So again, you have this very soon expectation. Another scene will soon be opened. I want to say one more thing. Oh, here's what I want to just mention. This is not part of Wesley's, but one of my, I will say a pet idea of mine, it's not a profound one, but that much eschatology does function as theodicy. Much eschatology is about this world really sucks. So God's going to have to do something, or surely we'll do something soon to remedy it. So that's the eschatological hope. If I can, I don't usually say that word, by the way, but I don't. All right. Now, I think right away or soon after that in this sermon, here's where it starts getting really interesting. Impossible, some people will say. Yea, the greatest of all impossibilities that we should see a Christian world, yea, a Christian nation, or even a city. How can these things be? So that's his imagined response, protest. I love what he says. On one supposition, indeed, not only all impossibility, but for that matter, all difficulty simply vanishes. Only suppose the Almighty to act irresistibly, and the thing is done. God, just imagine God saying, okay, end of the world as you know it, I'm bringing in the good one. With just the same ease as when God said, let there be light, and there was light. So he says, yeah, it wouldn't be that hard. In fact, it'd be easy, except, you got this but. But then, and I did change these. I don't know what happened with my slides. I actually have in there, but then human beings would no longer be human. Our inmost nature would be changed. We would no longer be moral agents any more than the sun or the wind, as we would no longer be endued with liberty, a power of choosing or self-determination. Consequently, we would no longer be capable of virtue or vice, of reward or punishment. What fascinates me here is that Wesley sort of thinks for a minute on what I think is a typical idea of eschatology, that if you put it whether Jesus will come back or God will draw the curtains or whatever, that there will be an end to the world because it's pretty bad. And Wesley says the problem with that is it would undo, I'm going to put it in my words, God's intention and project in creating human beings to begin with. Okay? The human being would no longer be human if God came in and unilaterally said, all done. The reason this is so critical is that Wesley, and this is rare, actually to find this in print where he's wrestling with this question, very unusual. Because he typically will go with the more divine activity bringing about the world to come. The problem he's having with it is his whole theology, as I said earlier, is predicated on the idea of this title, responsible grace. The responsible part here is the human. I've never really liked this title. It's not that grace is responsible, it's that grace, but divine grace calls us to responsibility. So for Wesley, this is so important to his doctrine of salvation. Or this is why he rejects, like the Calvinist rendering of predestination. Because he says it removes the human agency in relationship to God. Here's one of these rare places where he's actually shifting that over to eschatology and saying, we could imagine God just bringing in a brand new world that's, peachy keen, but God would violate human nature and the purpose of human existence if God were to do that. It's very interesting. Just think about it. You don't have to, and in fact, he goes on to say it, okay. Wesley's beginning to get himself into trouble right here. So the question that he's dealing with here, this clumsy knot, is the question of divine action or divine sovereignty, in which we might say, hey, God and God alone can usher in that world to come. And his own insistence on human agency and human responsibility, and it's a knot that we are not able to untie, okay? So we're going to set aside. The clumsy way of cutting the knot would just be to say, God will do it. That's the clumsy way. I'm setting that aside, he says. But if we set that aside, then we got a real problem. How can all people be made holy and happy while they still continue to be human beings? I guess this is the slide where I made him politically more correct. But so how can people be made holy and happy while they're still real humans with real agency and responsibility without God forcing them into becoming something, okay? While they still enjoy both the understanding, the affections, and the liberty which are essential to a moral agent. There seems to be a plain, simple way of removing the difficulty, I love this, without entangling ourselves in any subtle metaphysical disquisitions. And every time I read that, I think, too late. You've already done it. You just didn't realize it. But look at this next line. As God is one, okay? As God is one, so the work of God is uniform or consistent in all ages. Track with me now. As God is one, so the work of God is uniform or consistent in all ages. I wish he'd explained that a little bit more, because I think it would have been better if he'd said something like, the character of God is consistent, and therefore maybe the activity of God, but he just goes from the oneness of God to the work of God. But from there he says, may we not then conceive how God will work in the future on the souls of human beings by considering how God does work now and how God has worked in the times past. The problem is, he started this sermon talking about how bad a shape the world is in. He didn't deny that God had been working in it in times past, but it's not exactly the Garden of Eden. But he's insisting now that the way that God works has a consistency, and thus the idea that there would be a cataclysmic shebang doesn't really work with his presuppositions. So here's where he goes with this. This is like right the very next thing. Are you with me? You with me?
Yes.
All right. I know it's a lot of text. Check this one out. This one I heard very early on, I don't know, maybe in college sometime, but I love that, and this is very typical of Wesley. Here he is making an appeal to people's, his readers or his listeners' religious experience, or at least the idealized notion of their experience. He says, take one instance of this, and such an instance as you, O listener to the sermon, cannot easily be deceived in. You know how God worked in your own soul when God first enabled you to say, and then he quotes from Paul, the life I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. God did not take away your understanding, but enlightened your understanding and strengthened it. That's like good news right there. God did not destroy any of your affections, your loves. Rather, they were more vigorous than before. Least of all did God take away your liberty, your power of choosing good or evil. God did not force you when you became a believer, but being assisted by divine grace, you, like Mary, chose the better part. Assisted by divine grace, but you chose the better part. Of course, that's the story of Mary and Martha in the Gospel of Luke. Just as God assisted 5 in one house to make this happy choice, 5 or 50 or 500 in one city, many thousands in a nation, without depriving any of them of that liberty, which is essential to a moral agent. The point being that Wesley basically falls back on what is his typical way of thinking about how God works in the world, which is, while he'll say it isn't the only way God works, but typically God works with us, in partnership with us, calling to us, we'll even say empowering us, but not forcing, right? Well, what do you do with that if you're thinking, okay, that's going to be my eschatology, that's the way God's going to bring about the age to come? I want to say again, he already said we shouldn't expect God to work in some radically different way in the future than the way God worked in the past. But can I say again, this sermon starts off with saying, look at the shape the world is in. It's awful. So I guess that was the result of God working with human beings. It hadn't turned out so well yet. But he's not giving up on this, which I like. I like that. I admire him for this. But we could ask now, especially in this bigger universe, trying to come close to an end, shall God persuade, the way he's talking about in that sermon, an entire universe? I mean, what would that even mean? If we do want to think about a cosmic new creation, it seems to me like it's going to have to be kind of a unilateral act of God. It's not something we're going to really have a whole lot to do with, it seems. But I'm also a Wesleyan, so I want to stay close to Wesley. And so I kind of want to suggest at least another option, a more localized eschatology. That is, that we think about our role in this world on planet Earth. And these are April's slides here, as you might be able to tell. So we've got ocean science and engineering, human activity, I think here mostly, if not all, for the sake of the health of our oceans. This is the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, working to reforest 100 million hectares, is that how you say it, of land in Africa by 2030. She didn't send me these slides for this purpose, but I thought, I'm going to slap these in as saying something like, in the Wesleyan tradition, if we're coherent and consistent, we're going to think of God as desiring to always to work with us rather than over us or in spite of us. That seems probably to be a rather frustrating undertaking by our Creator. The King James Version does have an adjective for it, long-suffering. But this long-suffering love, if this is correct, continues to work with us in this way. Part of the problem is, I'm a very privileged human being speaking to a bunch of other privileged human beings at a university by the Pacific Ocean with all the comforts, without any treats today, by the way, which was noticed and even complained about as a typically first world problem. I guess we don't call it first world anymore, but anyway, you get the idea. Yeah. I forgot. Oh, so we have all this. So that's the other side of this. What I hear like on my other shoulder is, well, what a nice eschatology if your life is pretty comfortable. Like, we're supposed to work together with God to make things better. Meanwhile, there are people starving to death, right now. Women being raped and abused this second, children, just the drugs, murder, the whole thing, where it might seem more pressing for eschatology to be a cry to God to come save us. And so I hear that, and then I hear Wesley saying, God's work in the world is uniform. It's like when God saved you. Now again, see, a Calvinist could say, hey, the reason I got saved is I was elected by God from eternity. Now I know I'm putting it extremely for a point, but where it isn't about my agency, it's about God's election. But for Wesley, it's a very different notion of God, who elects to love and to work with all people, and then, has to live with our responses. Now, I'm going to just end with this. I want to conclude with literally the last line of the sermon that I said I didn't like, but check out this conclusion. Now, by the way, this is not one of where we've worked with God and eventually, things have gone great. You should read the general spread of the gospel to see how optimistic he was about the Methodist movement itself really being the first wave of a universal redemption, clearly not of the whole universe, but of earth. I mean, he thought the Methodists were the beginning. Now we're a couple centuries later, and the poor Methodists are having a rough time. They can't even get along. And for Wesley, that was the key. Honestly, he said, we got to love each other. And when we love each other, we'll share all goods together. Well, I mean, he goes back to Acts chapter 2. I don't have the time to tell you that. But he basically says, in the power of the Holy Spirit, when people start seeing, oh, look at those people and the way they love each other and share with one another, and that will be the key, he said, especially for attracting the Islamic nations. He thought that was going to be very important to get Muslims' attention. He says, because the way we're living right now, well, they got no reason why they'd give us any attention whatsoever. So that's another sermon. But here at the end of this one, where it definitely is a work of God, a unilateral work of new creation. But you got to love this. And to crown it all, there will be a deep and intimate and uninterrupted union with God, a constant communion with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, through the Spirit. And then look at that ending. A continual enjoyment of the three-one God and of all the creatures in God. That's a cool way to end. All right, and so that's where I'm going to end, right there. Thank you.